The year was 2023. David Morrison stepped into the marble-floored lobby of the Meridian Tower in downtown San Francisco, his $3,000 Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished stone with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. At 39, David controlled a business empire worth over $300 million. Tech magazines called him a visionary. Forbes had featured him on 3 separate covers. Investment firms courted him like royalty. But on this particular Tuesday morning in October, David Morrison was about to walk into a boardroom and come face to face with a ghost from his past. A ghost who would shatter every assumption he had about success, about power, and about the choices that had brought him to this moment. You see, 11 years earlier, David had made what he believed was the smartest business decision of his life. He had calculated the cost-benefit analysis with the cold precision of a machine. He had weighed the assets and liabilities. He had projected future earnings and growth potential. And based on those calculations, he had walked away from his marriage to a small-town teacher named Sarah, convinced that she was holding him back from his true destiny. What David didn't know as he rode that elevator to the 42nd floor was that the woman sitting in the conference room above him had built something extraordinary from the ashes of their broken marriage. Something that would make his own achievements look small by comparison. Something that would force him to confront a truth he had spent 11 years running from. The meeting was supposed to be routine. A $400 million acquisition. The kind of deal David had executed dozens of times before. He had studied the target company's financials, analyzed their market position, reviewed their leadership structure. Everything looked perfect on paper. The CEO had an impressive track record, innovative vision, and the kind of growth metrics that made investors salivate. But there was one detail David's research team had overlooked. One crucial piece of information that would transform this business meeting into the most devastating reckoning of his life. The CEO he was about to meet, the brilliant mind behind this $400 million empire, the woman who had built something truly meaningful while he was busy accumulating empty victories, was Sarah Whitman. The same Sarah who had once cooked him breakfast in their tiny apartment kitchen. The same Sarah who had worked double shifts at a diner to pay their rent while he coded through the night. The same Sarah whose heart he had broken when he decided she wasn't good enough for his new life. As David's hand reached for that boardroom door handle, he had no idea that the next 30 minutes would unravel everything he thought he knew about winning and losing, about success and failure, about the difference between building wealth and building a life worth living. Before we start the story, please, like this video, comment and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. To understand how David Morrison could make such a catastrophic miscalculation, we need to go back to where it all began. The year was 2012. Barack Obama was president. The iPhone 5 had just been released. And in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Millbrook, Ohio, a 28-year-old computer programmer named David Morrison was about to receive the phone call that would change everything. David had been working on his first startup for 3 years, surviving on ramen noodles and the unwavering faith of the woman he had married right out of college. Sarah Morrison, 26 years old, taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary School. Her annual salary was $34,000. She drove a 2006 Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door and a radio that only worked on AM stations. But Sarah had something that would prove to be far more valuable than money. She had the ability to see potential in people before they could see it in themselves. While venture capitalists were hanging up on David's pitches, Sarah was working 16-hour days to keep their dreams alive. She would teach her 3rd graders during the day, then rush to her evening job at Murphy's Diner, serving coffee and pie to truckers and night shift workers until 2 in the morning. Every dollar she earned went toward their shared future. Every sacrifice she made was an investment in David's vision. When he needed a new computer, Sarah sold her grandmother's jewelry. When he wanted to attend a tech conference in Austin, Sarah picked up extra shifts and ate peanut butter sandwiches for 2 weeks to make it happen. The phone call came on a rainy Thursday evening in November. David had been coding for 14 straight hours when his phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus Chen, a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley who had been tracking David's app for months. "David," Marcus said, his voice calm but electric with possibility, "I want to buy your company. $2.3 million. Cash. David dropped his phone. Sarah, who had been grading papers at their kitchen table, looked up with concern until she saw the expression on her husband's face. Then she started crying. Happy tears. Tears of relief and vindication, and the overwhelming joy that comes when years of struggle finally pay off. They celebrated that night with a bottle of $12 champagne from the corner store, dancing in their tiny living room to music playing from David's laptop speakers. Sarah kept saying, I knew it, I always knew you could do this. And David, holding his wife in his arms, felt like the luckiest man alive. But success, as David would soon discover, has a way of changing people. And the changes don't always happen all at once. They happen gradually, like water slowly eroding stone, until one day you wake up and realize you've become someone you don't recognize. The money changed everything, but it didn't change everything at once. At first, David and Sarah tried to maintain their normal life. They upgraded to a nicer apartment, bought Sarah a reliable car, paid off their student loans. David insisted on setting aside money for Sarah to pursue her master's degree in education. For a few months, it seemed like their love story was just getting started. But Silicon Valley was calling. David's app had caught the attention of major tech companies. Suddenly, everyone wanted to meet the brilliant young programmer from Ohio. Conference invitations arrived weekly. Investment opportunities flooded his inbox. Tech blogs wanted interviews. The world that had once ignored David Morrison now couldn't get enough of him. Sarah tried to adapt. She accompanied David to his first few networking events, smiling politely as venture capitalists and entrepreneurs discussed market disruption and scalability. But she was a fish out of water in these environments. While other wives talked about charity galas and investment portfolios, Sarah found herself discussing lesson plans and reading comprehension strategies with whoever would listen. David began to notice things that had never bothered him before. The way Sarah dressed seemed too casual for the upscale events they were attending. Her conversation topics felt provincial compared to the global business discussions happening around them. When someone asked what she did for work, her answer of elementary school teacher seemed to dampen the conversation rather than enhance it. The criticism started small. Maybe you could wear something a little more formal to the TechCrunch event, David suggested. And try to talk about something other than your students. These people are interested in innovation, not third-grade reading levels. Sarah tried to comply. She bought new clothes, researched tech trends, practiced discussing David's business with the kind of enthusiasm his new contacts expected. But the harder she tried to fit into David's evolving world, the more out of place she felt. And the more out of place she felt, the more David began to see her as a liability rather than a partner. The conversations at home grew tense. David would return from business trips full of excitement about new opportunities, new connections, new possibilities. Sarah would share stories about her students, about breakthrough moments in the classroom, about the simple joy of watching a child learn to read. These conversations, which had once been the highlight of David's day, now felt like anchors dragging him back to a life he was rapidly outgrowing. The turning point came during a dinner party at the home of a successful tech executive in Palo Alto. David had flown out for a series of meetings, and Sarah had joined him for what was supposed to be a romantic weekend getaway. Instead, she found herself sitting at a dinner table surrounded by Silicon Valley elite, struggling to contribute to conversations about artificial intelligence and venture capital. When someone asked Sarah about her work, she lit up as she always did when discussing education. She talked passionately about a breakthrough she'd had with a struggling student, about the importance of early childhood education, about the joy of watching young minds develop and grow. The table listened politely, but David could see the glazed look in their eyes. This wasn't the kind of conversation that led to business deals or investment opportunities. Later that night, in their hotel room, David exploded. Do you have any idea how that looked? These people control hundreds of millions of dollars, and you're talking about finger painting and multiplication tables. You're making me look small, Sarah. You're making us both look small. Sarah stared at her husband, seeing a stranger where her best friend used to be. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't realize that caring about children's education was something to be ashamed of. But David was just getting started. It's not about being ashamed. It's about understanding your audience. It's about growth. It's about becoming the kind of people who can make a real impact in the world. I thought I was making a real impact, Sarah replied. I thought helping children learn and grow was important. Of course it's important, David said, his voice growing colder. But it's small, Sarah. It's local. These people think globally. They're changing the world, and I want to be part of that. I need to be part of that. And I need a partner who can help me get there, not hold me back. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Sarah felt something break inside her chest, a sound like glass shattering in an empty room. This was the moment she realized that the man she had married, the man she had sacrificed everything for, no longer saw her as his partner. He saw her as an obstacle to overcome. And David, despite the cruelty of his words, genuinely believed he was being honest about their situation. In his mind, he was simply acknowledging reality. Sarah's world was small, his was expanding. She was content with their old life, he wanted something bigger. It seemed logical to him that they would need to make changes if they wanted to grow together. What David didn't understand yet was that growth without character isn't growth at all. It's just expansion. And expansion without foundation eventually leads to collapse. But that lesson was still years away. For now, David Morrison was convinced that he was simply being practical about their future. The future, as it turned out, would prove him spectacularly wrong. The months following that disastrous dinner party marked the beginning of the end for David and Sarah Morrison. David threw himself into building his next venture with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He was determined to prove that his first success wasn't a fluke, that he belonged in the upper echelons of Silicon Valley society. Sarah, meanwhile, retreated into her work at Millbrook Elementary. Teaching had always been her sanctuary, but now it became her refuge. In her classroom, surrounded by 8-year-olds who thought she was the smartest person in the world, Sarah could forget about feeling inadequate. She could forget about the growing distance between her and her husband. She could focus on what she did best, helping young minds discover their potential. But even in her sanctuary, Sarah couldn't escape the reality of her crumbling marriage. David's visits home became less frequent and shorter in duration. When he was there physically, his mind was elsewhere. He spent their conversations checking his phone, responding to emails, taking calls from investors and partners. Sarah felt like she was living with a ghost of the man she had married. The breaking point came on a cold February evening in 2013. David had been in San Francisco for 2 weeks, longer than any previous trip. When he finally returned to Millbrook, he carried himself differently. His posture was straighter, his clothes more expensive, his demeanor more distant. He looked like success, but he no longer looked like home. Sarah had prepared his favorite dinner, hoping to reconnect after the long separation. She had so much to tell him about her students, about a new teaching methodology she wanted to try, about the possibility of pursuing her master's degree. But David barely touched his food. He sat across from her at their small dining table, but he might as well have been on another planet. "We need to talk," David said finally, pushing his plate away. The words sent ice through Sarah's veins. In her experience, conversations that began with, "we need to talk," never ended well. David stood up and began pacing their small living room, running his hands through his hair in a gesture Sarah recognized as his nervous habit. "This isn't working, Sarah. This back and forth between two different worlds. I can't keep living in Millbrook and building a business in Silicon Valley. I can't keep pretending that we want the same things." Sarah felt her heart beginning to race. "What are you saying, David?" "I'm saying we have a choice to make. We can move to San Francisco together and build something bigger than either of us could achieve alone. Or we can keep living separate lives until we become strangers to each other." On the surface, David's proposal seemed reasonable. He was offering her a chance to be part of his new life, to grow together into something greater. But Sarah could hear what he wasn't saying. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. It was an ultimatum: become who I need you to be, or become irrelevant to my future. What about my job? Sarah asked. What about my students? I'm in the middle of the school year, David. I have kids who are counting on me. David's expression hardened. There are schools in San Francisco, Sarah. There are students everywhere. But this opportunity, this moment in my career, it won't wait. The tech industry moves fast. If I don't strike now while I have momentum, I might never get another chance like this. Sarah stared at her husband, trying to find traces of the man who had once valued her opinions, who had once seen her work as important, who had once treated her dreams as equal to his own. And if I say no, if I say I'm not ready to leave everything behind and start over in a place where I don't know anyone? The silence that followed her question was answer enough. David's face went through a series of expressions: frustration, disappointment, and finally, resignation. Then I guess we both know where we stand. For the next 3 hours, they talked in circles. Sarah tried to find compromises, suggesting she could finish the school year and join him in the summer, or that he could commute from their current home until she was ready to make the transition. But David had already made his decision. He needed a partner who could seamlessly integrate into his new world, someone who could enhance his professional image rather than complicate it. I've met someone, David said finally, the words dropping into their conversation like stones into still water. Her name is Victoria. She's a marketing executive with connections throughout the valley. She understands the business, Sarah. She gets what I'm trying to build. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. You've met someone. It's not what you think, David said quickly. Nothing has happened between us. But she's shown me what's possible. She's shown me what it looks like to be with someone who can be a true partner in this world. The cruelty of David's words was breathtaking. He was essentially telling Sarah that 11 years of marriage, sacrifice, and unwavering support meant nothing compared to the professional advantages another woman could offer him. He was reducing their relationship to a cost-benefit analysis, and she had been found lacking. I supported you when you had nothing, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I worked 2 jobs to pay our bills while you chased your dreams. I believed in you when nobody else would even take your calls. Doesn't that mean anything? David's response would echo in Sarah's mind for years to come. The past is the past, Sarah. I need someone who can help me build my future, not someone who wants to keep me trapped in what we used to be. The divorce proceedings began 3 weeks later. David had clearly been planning this moment for some time because he already had lawyers, paperwork, and a timeline mapped out with corporate efficiency. What Sarah had thought was a marriage worth fighting for, David treated as a business transaction to be concluded as quickly and cleanly as possible. Sarah hired a local attorney, a kind woman in her 50s who specialized in family law. But from the beginning, it was clear that Sarah wasn't interested in fighting. She didn't want David's money, his investments, or his assets. She wanted out of a marriage that had become a prison, free from the constant feeling that she wasn't good enough for the life her husband was building. The negotiations were remarkably straightforward. David kept the house, the cars, the investment accounts, and the business interests. Sarah asked for nothing beyond her personal belongings and the right to return to her maiden name. Her lawyer warned her that she was entitled to much more, that David's newfound wealth meant she could secure a comfortable financial future for herself. But Sarah had no interest in profiting from the destruction of her marriage. I don't want his money, Sarah told her attorney. I want my self-respect back. The final divorce hearing took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in April 2013. Sarah sat in the courthouse wearing her best dress, the same one she had worn to David's first networking event. She watched as the judge reviewed their settlement agreement, officially dissolving their marriage with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency reserved for business transactions. David looked every inch the successful entrepreneur, expensive suit, confident posture, the aura of a man who had made the right decision and was ready to move forward with his life. He barely looked at Sarah during the proceedings, treating her like a stranger rather than the woman who had shared his bed, his dreams, and his struggles for 11 years. When it was over, they walked out of the courthouse together for the last time. The spring rain had intensified, turning the courthouse steps slippery and treacherous. For a moment, they stood under the awning, two people who had once been everything to each other, now reduced to awkward small talk about logistics and timing. "I'll have the movers come for your things on Saturday," David said, checking his phone as he spoke. "Will you be there, or should I coordinate with your attorney?" Sarah stared at him, amazed by his ability to reduce the end of their marriage to scheduling details. "I'll be there." David nodded and started to walk away, then stopped and turned back. For just a moment, Sarah saw a flicker of something in his eyes that looked like regret, or perhaps uncertainty. "Sarah," he said, his voice softer than it had been in months. "I hope you understand that this isn't personal. This is just business." "No, David," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "This was our marriage. It was supposed to be personal. That was the whole point." David opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. He nodded once, more to himself than to her, and walked away into the rain. Sarah watched him go, realizing that she was witnessing the end of one chapter of her life and the uncertain beginning of another. The divorce was finalized on May 15, 2013. David Morrison was officially free to pursue his vision of success without the complications of a wife who didn't fit into his new world. Sarah Whitman, reverting to her maiden name, was officially free to discover who she was when she wasn't trying to be someone else's idea of the perfect partner. David moved to San Francisco within a month, renting a luxury apartment in Soma and diving headfirst into building his next company. He posted pictures on social media of networking events, business dinners, and weekend getaways with Victoria, who proved to be everything he had hoped: beautiful, connected, and professionally savvy. Sarah returned to her childhood bedroom in her parents' house in Millbrook, sleeping in the same bed she had occupied as a teenager. At 31 years old, she felt like her life was over before it had really begun. She had no savings, no assets, no clear path forward. All she had was a teaching degree, a broken heart, and a stubborn refusal to let David Morrison's rejection define her worth. What neither of them could have predicted was that Sarah's greatest achievements were still ahead of her. While David was busy building companies designed to maximize profit, Sarah was about to discover her true calling: building something that would maximize human potential. The teacher who had once felt inadequate in Silicon Valley boardrooms was about to prove that the most important innovations aren't always the ones that make the most money. They were the ones that make the most difference. David Morrison's second act began with all the confidence of a man who had made the right decision at the right time. His move to San Francisco in the summer of 2013 marked the beginning of what business magazines would later call his golden decade. He rented a sleek apartment in the South of Market District, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Bay Bridge that cost him more per month than Sarah's annual teaching salary. His relationship with Victoria Reynolds developed exactly as he had envisioned. She was everything Sarah wasn't: politically connected, socially sophisticated, and professionally ambitious. Victoria had an MBA from Wharton and 5 years of experience in tech marketing. She spoke fluently about market penetration strategies and customer acquisition costs. When they attended industry events together, she enhanced David's image rather than complicating it. More importantly, Victoria understood the game they were playing. She knew which investors mattered, which conferences provided the best networking opportunities, and which restaurants were considered power lunch destinations. She was a strategic asset disguised as a romantic partner, and David convinced himself this was exactly what he needed. His second startup, a social media analytics platform called MetricFlow, launched in early 2014. The company addressed a real need in the rapidly expanding social media landscape, helping businesses understand and optimize their online presence. David had learned from his first success: building a more robust business model and assembling a team of experienced developers and marketers. Victoria's connections proved invaluable during MetricFlow's funding rounds. She introduced David to venture capitalists she had worked with in previous roles, helped him craft pitches that resonated with investors, and provided the kind of professional polish that separated successful entrepreneurs from brilliant amateurs. The company grew rapidly. Within 18 months, Metricflow had signed contracts with major corporations, expanded their team to over 40 employees, and raised $15 million in Series A funding. David was profiled in TechCrunch, invited to speak at industry conferences, and courted by larger companies interested in acquisition discussions. But success in Silicon Valley isn't just about building profitable companies. It's about building profitable companies while maintaining the image of someone who deserves success. David threw himself into this aspect of entrepreneurship with the same intensity he brought to product development. He cultivated relationships with journalists, investors, and fellow entrepreneurs. He joined exclusive clubs, attended the right parties, and made sure his social media presence reflected the lifestyle of a successful tech executive. The acquisition offer came in late 2015. Tech Global, a multinational corporation with interests in data analytics and digital marketing, offered to buy Metricflow for $47 million. David negotiated the deal over 3 months, ultimately agreeing to a purchase price that made him worth nearly $50 million before his 32nd birthday. The success felt different this time. The first sale had been exciting because it represented validation, proof that his ideas had value. The second sale was satisfying because it represented strategy, proof that he could replicate success through careful planning and execution. David married Victoria in a lavish ceremony in Napa Valley 6 months after the Metricflow acquisition. The wedding was featured in several lifestyle magazines, photographed by the same photographer who shot celebrity weddings, and attended by a who's who of Silicon Valley elite. On paper, David Morrison had achieved everything he had dreamed of: wealth, status, professional recognition, and a partner who enhanced rather than hindered his ambitions. But somewhere in the middle of his 3rd year of marriage, David began to notice things that troubled him. Victoria's support felt increasingly transactional. She was enthusiastic about his successes but impatient with his doubts. She loved the lifestyle his wealth provided, but showed little interest in the work that made it possible. When David tried to discuss his ideas for future ventures, Victoria's feedback focused more on market potential than innovative value. Their conversations followed predictable patterns. Victoria would share gossip from her marketing consulting work, discuss vacation destinations and real estate opportunities, and update David on the social events they needed to attend to maintain their professional network. David found himself longing for the kind of conversations he used to have with Sarah, discussions about ideas and dreams and the kind of work that felt meaningful beyond its profit potential. By 2018, David's 3rd startup, an artificial intelligence platform called Cognicore, was generating significant interest from major tech companies. The company's valuation reached $120 million when Google acquired it in a deal that made David worth over $200 million. But the celebration felt hollow. David stood in his penthouse apartment, looking out at the San Francisco skyline, surrounded by the trappings of success, and realized he felt more alone than he had at any point in his life. Victoria was at a spa weekend with friends, celebrating the acquisition in her own way. His employees were excited about their stock options and new opportunities at Google. His investors were calculating returns and looking for the next big thing. And David found himself thinking about Sarah for the first time in years. Not romantically, but with a kind of nostalgic curiosity. He wondered what she was doing, whether she had remarried, whether she was happy. He wondered if she had seen the news coverage of his latest success, and if so, what she thought about the choices they had both made. These thoughts troubled him because they suggested a level of dissatisfaction he wasn't prepared to acknowledge. David Morrison was supposed to be living his best life. He had achieved everything he had set out to accomplish. He was wealthy, successful, and married to a woman who perfectly complemented his professional image. So why did he feel like something essential was missing? While David was building his empire in Silicon Valley, Sarah Whitman was learning to rebuild her life from the ground up. The first year after her divorce was the hardest of her life. She moved back into her childhood bedroom, sleeping in a twin bed surrounded by high school photos and college pennants, feeling like a failure at 31 years old. The teaching position at Millbrook Elementary was still available when she returned, and Sarah threw herself into her work with an intensity born of necessity. She needed something to focus on besides her broken marriage, something that reminded her of her value as a human being. Her third-grade classroom became her laboratory for healing, both for her students and for herself. But Sarah discovered something interesting during those long days of lesson planning and grading papers. Her experience with failure had given her a new perspective on education. She understood struggle in a way she never had before. She recognized the signs of a child who felt inadequate, who believed they weren't smart enough or capable enough to succeed. She had become an expert in those feelings. Sarah began developing new teaching methods focused on building confidence alongside competence. She created individualized learning plans that met students where they were rather than where they were supposed to be. She spent extra time with struggling readers, not just teaching them phonics and vocabulary, but helping them understand that their worth as human beings wasn't determined by their reading level. Word spread quickly through the small town. Parents began requesting Sarah specifically for their children. Other teachers started asking about her methods. The principal noticed that students who had been considered problem cases were thriving in Sarah's classroom. But Sarah's real breakthrough came when she started staying after school to help students who were falling behind. What began as informal tutoring sessions grew into structured programs. Parents started asking if they could pay Sarah to work with their children outside of school hours. Other teachers requested professional development sessions to learn her techniques. By her third year back in Millbrook, Sarah was running after-school programs, weekend workshops, and summer learning camps. She was earning more from her tutoring and consulting work than from her teaching salary. More importantly, she was helping children who had been written off by traditional educational approaches discover their potential. The turning point came during a conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez, the mother of one of Sarah's students. Miguel had been struggling with reading for 2 years before joining Sarah's class. Traditional teaching methods hadn't worked for him, and he had begun to believe he was stupid. But Sarah's individualized approach helped Miguel discover that he was a visual learner who needed different strategies to process written information. "Miss Sarah," Mrs. Rodriguez said after a parent-teacher conference, "you saved my son. But there are so many other children who need what you're doing. Have you ever thought about sharing this with more people?" The question planted a seed that would eventually grow into something extraordinary. Sarah began researching online education platforms, distance learning technologies, and the growing market for educational support services. She discovered that parents everywhere were struggling with the same issues she was addressing in Millbrook. Children who were falling behind in traditional classrooms, parents who wanted to help but didn't know how, and teachers who needed better resources and training. Sarah spent her evenings and weekends learning about business development, market research, and technology platforms. She had no formal business training, but she had something more valuable: a deep understanding of a real problem and practical experience solving it. In 2016, 3 years after her divorce, Sarah launched Learning Bridge from her one-bedroom apartment. The platform started as a simple website offering online tutoring services and educational resources for parents. Sarah handled everything herself, creating content, managing the website, scheduling sessions, and working with students via video conference. The business grew organically through word-of-mouth recommendations. Parents who saw results with their children referred friends and relatives. Teachers who attended Sarah's professional development workshops became advocates for her methods. Students who had struggled in traditional classrooms found success through Learning Bridge's individualized approach. Sarah reinvested every dollar of profit back into the platform. She hired her first employee in 2017, a part-time customer service representative who helped manage the growing volume of inquiries. She expanded her course offerings to include support for different age groups and learning challenges. She developed partnerships with educational consultants and child psychologists to ensure her methods were grounded in the latest research. By 2018, Learning Bridge was serving over 5,000 students across 12 states. Sarah had built a team of 23 employees, including certified teachers, educational consultants, and technology specialists. The platform offered everything from one-on-one tutoring to comprehensive learning assessments to professional development courses for teachers. But Sarah's greatest innovation wasn't technological. It was philosophical. Learning Bridge operated on the principle that every child could succeed if given the right support and encouragement. The platform didn't just teach academic skills. It built confidence, resilience, and a love of learning that lasted beyond individual subjects or grade levels. Parents reported remarkable transformations in their children. Kids who had been labeled as learning disabled discovered they simply learned differently. Students who had given up on school found renewed enthusiasm for education. Teachers who felt overwhelmed by diverse classroom needs found practical strategies for reaching every student. The financial success followed naturally from the educational impact. Learning Bridge's revenue grew from $50,000 in its first year to over $2 million by 2019. Sarah moved the company to a proper office space, hired additional staff, and began exploring opportunities for national expansion. But unlike David, Sarah measured success in more than financial terms. She kept a file of thank you letters from parents, photos from students who had overcome learning challenges, and testimonials from teachers who had found new passion for their profession through Learning Bridge's training programs. By 2020, Sarah Whitman had built something that David Morrison, for all his wealth and status, had never achieved, a company that made money by making a meaningful difference in people's lives. Learning Bridge wasn't just profitable, it was purposeful. It wasn't just successful, it was significant. And Sarah was about to prove that the greatest revenge isn't getting even. It's living well. October 17, 2023. David Morrison's assistant had confirmed the meeting 3 times, which was unusual but not unprecedented for a deal of this magnitude. Morrison Capital was considering the acquisition of Learning Bridge, an education technology company that had caught David's attention through its impressive growth metrics and innovative approach to personalized learning. The target company was valued at $400 million, making it one of the largest potential acquisitions in David's portfolio. His research team had provided comprehensive due diligence reports covering everything from financial projections to competitive analysis. The CEO had an impressive track record, having built the company from nothing to a major player in the education technology space in just 7 years. David arrived at the Meridian Tower conference room 15 minutes early, a habit he had developed to establish psychological advantage in negotiations. He reviewed his notes one final time. Learning Bridge served over 2 million students worldwide, employed over 300 people, and had revolutionized the way struggling learners received educational support. The company's approach fascinated David from a business perspective. Rather than focusing on high-achieving students who were easy to teach, Learning Bridge specialized in reaching children who had been failed by traditional educational methods. They had developed proprietary assessment tools, individualized learning plans, and support systems that produced measurable improvements in student outcomes. What impressed David most was the scalability of the model. Learning Bridge had created a system that could be replicated across different markets, languages, and educational systems. The company's growth trajectory suggested they could become a global leader in educational technology within the next 5 years. At exactly 2 p.m., David's assistant knocked on the conference room door. "Mr. Morrison, the Learning Bridge team is here." David stood up, straightened his tie, and prepared to meet the CEO who had built this remarkable company. He was curious about the kind of person who could create such an innovative approach to education while building a business worth nearly $500 million. The conference room door opened, and David's world stopped. Sarah Whitman walked into the room with the confidence of someone who belonged there, who had earned her place through years of hard work and measurable results. She wore a navy blue business suit that conveyed professionalism without sacrificing femininity. Her hair was shorter than David remembered, styled in a way that looked both sophisticated and approachable. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They held the same intelligence and warmth he remembered, but now they also held something he had never seen before. Power. "Hello, David," Sarah said, her voice steady and professional. "I should have realized Morrison Capital might be interested in Learning Bridge. You always did have an eye for opportunity." David stared at her, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. The small-town teacher he had dismissed as provincial and limited had become the CEO of a $400 million company. The woman he had left behind because she wasn't sophisticated enough for his world had built something more impressive than anything he had ever achieved. "Sarah," David managed to say, his voice barely concealing his shock. I had no idea." That learning bridge was my company? Sarah asked, settling into her chair with the ease of someone who had conducted hundreds of such meetings. Or that I was capable of building something like this? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with 11 years of history. David's research team had somehow missed the connection between Sarah Whitman, CEO of Learning Bridge, and Sarah Morrison, the elementary school teacher he had divorced in 2013. Or perhaps they had found the connection but assumed it wasn't relevant to the business discussion. Sarah's team filed into the conference room behind her, a chief technology officer, a head of operations, and a chief financial officer. They arranged themselves around the table with the practiced efficiency of executives who had been through this process before. David realized with growing amazement that Sarah wasn't just the founder of Learning Bridge. She was leading a sophisticated business operation with the kind of professional team that most entrepreneurs spent years trying to assemble. "Shall we begin?" Sarah asked, opening her laptop and connecting it to the room's presentation system. "I understand Morrison Capital is interested in acquiring Learning Bridge. I'm curious to hear your vision for how our company would fit into your portfolio." David struggled to regain his composure. He was supposed to be leading this meeting, supposed to be the one asking questions and evaluating opportunities. Instead, he found himself in the unprecedented position of being completely off balance in a business negotiation. "Before we start," David said, "I think we should acknowledge the unusual nature of this situation." Sarah's expression remained neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean." Morrison Capital expressed interest in acquiring Learning Bridge. "We're here to discuss that possibility." "What's unusual about that?" David realized that Sarah was going to handle this meeting with complete professionalism, giving no indication that they had any personal history. She was treating him like any other potential investor, which was somehow more unsettling than if she had shown anger or resentment. "Of course," David said, forcing himself to focus on the business at hand. "Please, proceed with your presentation." What followed was the most impressive business presentation David had ever witnessed. Sarah walked him through Learning Bridge's origin story, growth trajectory, and market position with the kind of clarity and confidence that came from deep understanding of every aspect of the business. She explained how Learning Bridge had identified a massive gap in the educational market, millions of children who were struggling in traditional classrooms but could succeed with personalized support. The company had developed proprietary assessment tools that could identify each child's unique learning style, then create customized educational plans that addressed their specific needs. The results were remarkable. Learning Bridge students showed measurable improvements in reading comprehension, mathematical skills, and overall academic confidence. The platform had helped over 50,000 children who had been labeled as learning disabled discover that they simply learned differently. Parents reported increased self-esteem, better grades, and renewed enthusiasm for education in their children. But Sarah hadn't just built an effective educational program. She had built a scalable business model that could reach millions of children worldwide. Learning Bridge operated in 15 countries, offered content in 8 languages, and had partnerships with school districts, educational consultants, and child development specialists. The financial metrics were equally impressive. Learning Bridge had generated consistent revenue growth of 40 to 60% annually for 7 consecutive years. The company was profitable, debt-free, and sitting on cash reserves of over $30 million. Their customer retention rate was above 90%, and they had a waiting list of over 100,000 families seeking their services. As Sarah presented these achievements, David found himself genuinely impressed by what she had accomplished. This wasn't just a successful business, it was a meaningful enterprise that had improved the lives of millions of children and families. Sarah had created something that generated substantial profits while serving a genuine social good. "Our mission has always been simple," Sarah explained as she concluded her presentation. "Every child deserves the opportunity to discover their potential. Traditional educational approaches work well for some students, but millions of children need different strategies to succeed. Learning Bridge exists to serve those children and their families." David sat in silence for several moments, processing what he had just heard. The woman he had left because she thought too small had built something global. The teacher he had dismissed as unprofessional had created a more sophisticated business operation than most of his portfolio companies. The wife he had abandoned for limiting his potential had achieved something he had never managed, building wealth while making a meaningful difference in the world. "I have to ask," David said finally, "how did you transition from elementary school teaching to building a company of this scale?" Sarah's expression softened slightly, showing the first hint of personal warmth since she had entered the room. "Necessity is a powerful teacher, David. When you're forced to rebuild your life from nothing, you discover capabilities you never knew you had. The divorce taught me that I couldn't depend on anyone else to determine my worth or my future. I had to figure out what I was truly capable of accomplishing." The words hit David like a physical blow. Sarah was telling him, in the most professional way possible, that his abandonment had been the catalyst for her greatest achievements. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and transformed it into the foundation for building something extraordinary. "The children I was working with after the divorce helped me understand something important," Sarah continued. "Most people aren't failing because they lack ability. They're failing because they haven't found the right environment to discover their strengths." That insight became the foundation for everything Learning Bridge does. David realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in his business career. He had come to this meeting expecting to evaluate an acquisition target. Instead, he was being educated about the difference between building wealth and building worth, between achieving success and creating significance. After the formal presentation concluded, David asked to speak with Sarah privately. Her team left the conference room, and suddenly the space felt much smaller. They were no longer CEO and potential investor. They were two people with 11 years of shared history sitting across from each other in an empty room. "I need to say something," David began, his voice lacking the confidence he usually brought to business negotiations. "What you've built here, it's incredible. I had no idea you were capable of something like this." Sarah's response was measured and direct. "You never gave me the chance to show you what I was capable of, David. You made assumptions about my limitations based on your own narrow definition of success." David felt the truth of her words settle into his chest like a weight. "You're right. I was young, I was arrogant, and I thought I knew what success looked like. I thought building wealth was the same thing as building a life worth living." "And now?" Sarah asked. David looked around the conference room, thinking about his penthouse apartment, his investment portfolio, his string of successful exits. "Now I realize that I've spent 11 years building companies that make money but don't make a difference. You've built something that does both." "Learning Bridge isn't just about profit," Sarah said. "It's about purpose. Every decision we make is guided by a simple question: will this help children discover their potential? That clarity of mission makes everything else easier." David found himself genuinely curious about Sarah's journey. "How did you learn to run a business? You didn't have an MBA or corporate experience." "I learned by doing," Sarah replied. "I made mistakes, lots of them. But I had something that proved more valuable than formal business training. I understood the problem I was trying to solve because I had lived it. I knew what it felt like to be underestimated, to be told I wasn't good enough, to have my potential dismissed by someone whose opinion mattered to me." The personal nature of her response created a moment of vulnerability that transcended their professional roles. David realized that Sarah wasn't just talking about business strategy, she was talking about the emotional foundation that had driven her success. "I'm sorry," David said quietly. "I'm sorry for the way I treated you, for the things I said, for making you feel like you weren't enough. You were always enough, Sarah. I was just too selfish and scared to see it." Sarah studied his face for a long moment before responding. "David, you don't owe me an apology. You made a choice based on what you thought you needed at the time. I made different choices based on what I learned I needed. We both became who we were supposed to become. But you became someone remarkable," David said. "You built something that matters. All I did was accumulate wealth." "You built successful companies," Sarah countered. "You created jobs, generated returns for investors, developed useful technologies. Those things have value too. David shook his head. But they don't have meaning. Not the way Learning Bridge does. You help children discover their potential. You change lives. I just move money around and call it innovation. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering 11 years of parallel journeys that had led them to this moment. David learned about Sarah's struggles during the first year after their divorce, her gradual discovery of her entrepreneurial abilities, and the challenges of building a company while maintaining her commitment to educational excellence. Sarah learned about David's professional achievements, his failed marriage to Victoria, and his growing sense that wealth without purpose was just elaborate emptiness. She discovered that the man who had once seemed so confident in his choices had spent years questioning whether he had traded everything meaningful for temporary success. "What happens now?" David asked as their conversation began to wind down. "With the acquisition, I mean." Sarah's response surprised him. "I'm not sure Learning Bridge is for sale, David. At least not in the traditional sense. This company represents more than just a business opportunity to me. It's my life's work, my contribution to making the world a little better than I found it." "But you agreed to this meeting," David pointed out. "I agreed to this meeting because I was curious," Sarah admitted. "I wanted to see what you had become, what you had built with the freedom you thought you needed. I wanted to understand whether you had found what you were looking for when you left our marriage behind." "And what's your assessment?" David asked. Sarah's answer was both honest and compassionate. "I think you built exactly what you thought you wanted. The question is whether what you wanted was what you actually needed." David sat in silence, considering the implications of her words. He had achieved every goal he had set for himself 11 years ago. He was wealthy, successful, and respected in his industry. But he had never felt more empty or alone than he did in this moment, sitting across from the woman who had built everything he had never thought to dream of. "I made a mistake," David said finally. "The biggest mistake of my life." Sarah's response was the final lesson he needed to hear. "David, you didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. We both did. The question isn't whether we made the right choices then. The question is what choices we're going to make now, with everything we've learned along the way." David Morrison returned to his penthouse that evening with his entire worldview fundamentally altered. The acquisition meeting that was supposed to be a routine business transaction had become the most important learning experience of his adult life. He stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the San Francisco skyline, and saw his reflection staring back at him, a wealthy man who had spent 11 years building the wrong kind of success. For the first time in his career, David found himself questioning not just the specifics of a business deal, but the entire framework through which he evaluated opportunity and value. Learning Bridge represented something he had never encountered before, a company that had achieved massive financial success by prioritizing social impact over profit maximization. Sarah had built something that made money because it made a difference, not the other way around. Her business model was driven by mission rather than margin, by purpose rather than profit. The result was a company that was both more valuable and more meaningful than anything in David's portfolio. David spent the next 3 days conducting the most thorough due diligence review of his career. But instead of focusing solely on financial projections and market analysis, he found himself studying Learning Bridge's impact metrics, reading testimonials from parents and students, and researching the educational methodologies that made the platform so effective. The more he learned, the more impressed he became. Learning Bridge wasn't just serving a market need, it was addressing a profound social challenge. Millions of children were struggling in traditional educational environments, not because they lacked intelligence or motivation, but because they needed different approaches to learning. Sarah had created a solution that was both scalable and sustainable, both profitable and purposeful. But David's interest in Learning Bridge had evolved beyond financial opportunity. He found himself genuinely curious about the possibility of contributing to something meaningful, of using his resources and experience to support work that mattered beyond its return on investment. The revelation came during a phone call with his own investment team. As they discussed the potential acquisition in terms of market penetration and revenue optimization, David realized that he had spent his entire career thinking about business in purely transactional terms. Companies existed to generate returns for investors. Success was measured by valuation multiples and exit strategies. Learning Bridge operated according to completely different principles. The company existed to help children discover their potential. Success was measured by educational outcomes and family satisfaction. Profit was important because it enabled the mission, not because it was the mission. David made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of pursuing a traditional acquisition, he proposed a partnership structure that would provide Learning Bridge with capital for expansion while allowing Sarah to maintain complete operational control. Morrison Capital would become a strategic investor, not an owner. The proposal was unprecedented in David's career. He was essentially offering to provide funding and business expertise without demanding the control that typically came with major investments. He was betting on Sarah's vision and leadership rather than trying to impose his own. When David presented the proposal to Sarah, her response was cautious but intrigued. "Why would you structure a deal this way? What's in it for Morrison Capital?" David's answer surprised them both. "For the first time in my career, I want to be part of something that matters more than the money it generates. Learning Bridge is changing lives, Sarah. That's worth more than any return on investment." The partnership between Morrison Capital and Learning Bridge was finalized 3 months later, but the real transformation had already begun. David restructured his entire investment philosophy, shifting his focus from companies that maximized short-term profits to enterprises that created long-term value for society. Learning Bridge used the new funding to expand into 12 additional countries, develop content for children with special needs, and create scholarship programs for families who couldn't afford their services. The company's mission remained unchanged, but their capacity to fulfill that mission grew exponentially. David found himself more engaged in business than he had been in years. Instead of simply reviewing financial reports, he was learning about educational methodologies, child development research, and the social factors that contributed to academic success. He was applying his business expertise to challenges that mattered beyond their profit potential. Sarah continued to lead Learning Bridge with the same passion and vision that had driven its creation. The company now served over 5 million students worldwide, employed over 800 people, and had helped transform educational outcomes for children who had been failed by traditional approaches. They worked together professionally, but their relationship remained carefully bounded by mutual respect and shared purpose. There was no romantic reconciliation. Too much had happened, too much time had passed, and both had become different people than they had been during their marriage. But there was something more valuable than romance. There was understanding. They had both learned that success without character is just wealth without worth. They had both discovered that the greatest achievements come not from what you accumulate, but from what you contribute. David learned that the fortune he had spent 11 years building was nothing compared to the fulfillment that came from building something meaningful. Sarah proved that the greatest revenge isn't getting even with those who underestimate you. It's exceeding every expectation they never thought to have. Today, David Morrison is still wealthy, but he measures his wealth differently. He has transformed his business model to focus on companies that create positive impact alongside financial returns. He has learned to value collaboration over domination, purpose over profit, meaning over money. Sarah Whitman continues to run Learning Bridge, which has become the world's largest provider of personalized educational support. She never remarried, but she is surrounded by meaningful relationships and work that fulfills her in ways she never imagined possible when she was sleeping in her childhood bedroom, wondering if her life was over. They see each other occasionally at industry conferences, where Sarah is now recognized as one of the most innovative leaders in educational technology, and David is known for his commitment to impact investing. Their interactions are cordial, even warm, marked by mutual respect and the recognition that they both became better people through their shared experience. The greatest lesson of their story isn't about love or marriage or divorce. It's about the difference between building wealth and building worth, between achieving success and creating significance, between getting what you want and discovering what you actually need. Success isn't about accumulating assets. It's about becoming the kind of person who deserves the life you're trying to build. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is learn to measure your wealth not by what you have, but by what you give, not by what you own, but by what you've helped others become. The greatest fortune isn't what you accumulate for yourself. It's what you create for others. And the richest life isn't the one with the most money. It's the one with the most meaning. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about your own definitions of success and fulfillment, let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts about what true wealth means to you. And remember, it's never too late to choose who you become next.